Hello, my name is Olu Osha. I like talking about American presidents. Today, I want to talk about a video that went viral. Um, it's a video of President Donald Trump, the 45th and 47th president. Of course, any video he makes, any comment, any speech goes viral because he's president and probably the most Googled man on the internet, and which must be have been the case over the past over 10 years now. In any event, on January the 6th, 2026, in a speech at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., President Trump expressed his fears. In fact, he sounded petrified as he said, if the Republicans didn't win the midterm elections, then he believed he was going to be impeached, right? Um, yeah, so he's been impeached twice already, but of course, after impeachment, it has to by Congress. It goes to the Senate, right? It goes to the Senate and they have to have a vote to convict him, right? And so that has never been the case on the previous two instances when he was impeached during his first term. He was never convicted by the Senate. The first American president to be impeached was Andrew Jackson, and he failed to be convicted by Senate uh, by one vote. Uh, President Bill Clinton has also been impeached, and of course, President Clinton has been impeached twice. So we've never had a president who's been removed through the impeachment process, which happens in Congress. And I'm sure many people will be like astonished. Now, if the Senate convicts, right after Congress impeaches and the Senate convicts, then the president is automatically removed from office. Um, he's no longer president. What's the mechanics for that? The mechanics is that, well, the person, he's no longer president, and of course the president is the head of the law enforcement. He's the chief enforcer in the country. He's head of all the agencies, and so it will be difficult. We'll be wondering that, okay, so who's going to remove him from the White House if he refuses to go, since all the heads of the agencies, law enforcement, the answer to him, since he's the chief executive officer of the United States. He heads the executive branch, and we know that the Senate, while they make the laws, they don't really have an enforcement arm. Well, the thing is, if the president refuses to leave himself after he's impeached, then the thing is he is a trespasser in the White House, because now he's no longer president immediately. Automatically, the vice president assumes the office of president. It's automatic. The 25th Amendment, which didn't happen until 1967, um, uh, and it assures this. So it provides the procedure for the vice president to take office, right, in place of the president. Now, of course, if you know American history, you realize that a lot of our a lot of the mechanics and procedures in our government are not thought ahead of time, and many times we've played it by ear. For instance, the succession to you know of the vice president in the event that a president dies in office. It wasn't clear; it was ambiguous. So, if anybody recalls, the first vice president to succeed a president who died in office was John Tyler, after William Henry Harrison died just after 1 month in office. And, people didn't know if he was a vice president acting as president, or if he was fully the president. And because the Constitution was ambiguous regarding this. And even our brilliant John Quincy Adams, who was congressman at the time, insisted that, the vice president was not really the president. It was just an acting president. But fortunately, John Tyler was a very strong-willed president, and he insisted that no, he's now the president of the United States, right? Um, and not an acting president. And no elections had to be held. And so, and in the past, right, when a vice president died in office, uh, until the 25th Amendment was ratified in 1967 during the uh, presidency of Lyndon Johnson, our 36th president, right? We didn't have procedures for a success for the appointment of a new vice president. So we've had many instances um, where a president actually um, um, didn't have a vice president throughout his administration. In fact, John Tyler didn't have a president because once he took office, assumed the position of a president, right? And of course, he was always called, he was disparaged as his accidency, throughout because of this. He didn't have a vice president. Who else didn't have a vice president? So several people, Franklin Pierce, when William Rufus King, his vice president, who you know, you know, when he died in office, he didn't have a new vice president. So this has been the case many times, many instances. We've had instances where a president actually did not have a vice president. You know, when his vice president died, prior to the ratification of the 25th Amendment in 1967. So the procedure is that once the president, if he refuses to leave office, if he's been convicted after an impeachment, if he refuses to leave the White House because he's now he becomes legally a trespasser, and so there can be legal procedures for law enforcement to actually arrest and remove the president, right? And following a conviction subsequent to impeachment, following a conviction in Senate, which removes the president, if there are going to be criminal charges filed against the president, then it goes to the courts. Now, something I want to clarify though, um, the way the president, who seems all powerful right now, that he's been able to take use a military intervention, which if Venezuela wasn't such a weaker uh, adversary or opponent, it would be an act of war, right? It would be an act of war. Certainly, President Trump would not have been able to order the military to go and remove President Putin of Russia or Xi Jinping of China, right? That would be an act of war, and only Congress, according to the Constitution, can declare war, not the president. And it appears that the president is acting in defiance. However, it's because the Congress, uh, through its acts and its actions, right, they've actually sort of given the president carte blanche to take limited military action, right, to repel attacks or to act in case of imminent threats, or to use his judgment in many instances. Because again, we have the sad memory of Pearl Harbor, 9/11, and so through the authorization for use of military force, which the Congress provided the president, and of course the war war powers resolution, it allows the president to use the military in limited action, for a period of 90 days without obtaining approval from Congress. And also they set a precedent. Remember, we were in a war with Vietnam that was never declared, in which Congress never declared war against Vietnam. And this was for almost 20 years. Over 58,000 American kids lost their lives. Over 300,000 Americans became disabled. And, so Congress set the precedent for that. Meanwhile, Congress kept funding the president. It kept because it's only Congress that can fund the military. Congress funds the government, not the president, right? So Congress has a way to stop a war, right? Because they can just cut off money. They can refuse to pay. If the government, if the president doesn't have the executive doesn't have the money, there's nothing they can do. So Congress has the power of the person, of the president, right? Whoever pays you is more powerful. So that leads to a question: who's more powerful, the president, who can order the military to do whatever he wants, right? Ostensibly, apparently, or Congress. I know we always refer to how America copied the Roman Empire, right, in their structure of government. And we all know the emperor, right, was stronger than the Senate, right? Um, I'm just going to take us back because I love the Roman Empire, right? There are good things that the Romans did, but there are many things that they did bad. So yes, the during the era of Augustus, the founder of the Roman Empire, he arrogated all power to himself. He had the executive, the judicial, and even the legislative power. It was all Augustus, but because he was so clever, right? Because he knew Romans didn't want a king, and his great uncle, who'd made him his heir, had been assassinated, right? Right, because by the senators, right in Senate, because he was sitting. He had a special seat. He was a king all in all but name only, right? He'd made himself dictator for life. uh, Augustus understood that, so he reinstituted the Senate, right? But they were just a figure, right? They were just a he was a puppeteer, right? The Senate was just a rubber stamp body, right? They had no power. And he reconstituted the Senate. And in fact, he didn't have a special throne or anything. He didn't call himself emperor, even though, well, all the documents were there that he was imperator, he was emperor, and that was for his successor to use the title. So Augustus personally, because he was creating something new, he ruled for a long time, right, over 40 years. He actually sat with the senators, right? So he didn't have a special seat. He sat with them, and of course, they gave him the title revered one. So he pretended, he kept the facade that the republic was still there, right? And even the title he called himself Princeps, first citizen, right? He sat with the Senate, but what he had created, and it's in his Reis Gesti Reis Gesti Divi Augusti. That's the deeds of the divine Augustus. So that was sort of his autobiography of what he did. You see, it's the structure of the government that he had created. The emperor was actually the most powerful person. All powers were in the emperor's hands. So in this case, it was the executive, the emperor, who created a new senate. But that senate was just a rubber stamp figure, right? It was just a rubber stamp body. It had no power. All power, all the powers were with Augustus. Sometimes he would increase the Senate. Every time he conquered a new people, he would take their leaders and increase the Senate. So he would get a new group of people who had allegiance, towards him, right? Their rise was because of him. So he'd get new, more support, consolidate his power. So he did that. Sometimes he'd reduce the numbers of the Senate if he was upset with them. Sometimes he'd decrease it. So he did all sorts of stuff. So he was the one now manipulating the Senate. So Augustus created the Senate. So the body that creates something is a more powerful organ. So during the Roman Empire, the emperor was obviously more powerful than the Senate. But when you look at us in America, right, did the executive create Congress? No, it was Congress that created the executive, the president, right? Remember, there was a constitutional convention in about, was it 1787? And because our original, when we were under the Articles of Confederation, um, we had a unicameral body. We didn't have an executive, right? We didn't have an executive. We had just a legislature. and then they called a convention. A convention is another name for Congress. And it was that convention that approved the Constitution. They approved and ratified the Constitution, which was amongst the drafters of the Constitution was, of course, James Madison. It was approved. Um, the authors of the Federalist Papers, including Alexander Hamilton, who wrote majority of it, over 60%, and James Madison wrote about 30%, and the remaining about 35%, and the remaining 5% was written by John Jay, who became our first Chief Justice. They wrote these Federalist Papers to persuade the states delegates, the states to ratify the new Constitution, which now created a more powerful executive. But it was Congress, right? It was Congress because the convention was, they were Congress. They created the executive. So the body, the organ that creates something has more power, right? The organ that creates something has more power. So Congress really technically has more power than the executive. But now we've never seen Congress use its power, right, to remove the president. But Congress, technically on paper, they're Article 1, right? So they're the first, they're the creator of the government. First of all, their power comes from the people. They said, we the people. And then they create the executive, which is Article 2. And then there's Article 3. So they're supposed to be co-equal. They're supposed to be co-equal. But we know the judiciary has no enforcement power. So in reality, in practice, it's been the weakest of the three branches because they don't have any law enforcement powers. And we see it in the way Andrew Jackson treated them in the famous case, landmark case of Worcester versus Georgia in 1832 regarding the sovereignty of the Indian nations. And Chief Justice John Marshall, our greatest Chief Justice and longest Chief Justice, who was, by the way, a cousin of Thomas Jefferson, but they hated each other, right? So there was the famous Marbury versus Madison, or Madison versus Marbury case, right? And this was Chief Justice John Marshall, in which he provided judicial review, the concept of judicial review, in which he sort of gave the courts more power by saying that the judiciary is able to review any act by the executive or the or Congress or the legislative branch and deem it unconstitutional. So they declared the power of judicial review. Uh, you know, so that's very important. But I was talking about the Worcester versus the Georgia case of 1832, in which even though John Marshall sided uh, with the indigenous people, Native Americans, and declared that they, were a sovereign nation, and the states, Georgia could not make uh, laws, affecting them. Um, the chief executive, who was Andrew Jackson, our seventh president, he repudiated uh, the decision of the courts, right? And he said, well, Chief Justice John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. And in fact, he declared the law stillborn, right? So he was basically saying that they were trying to say that Georgia could not pass laws to remove um, the Cherokee Nation, but of course, Andrew Jackson favored the removal of the Indians, and so um, the infamous uh, Trail of Tears occurred, and he ignored, uh, the a decision by the courts, right? He ignored the decision by the courts, so it's very difficult for a chief justice to consequently say, "Well, go and arrest the president." They can't do that. They don't have the ability to do that. While he's sitting as president, they don't have the ability to do that. And even Abraham Lincoln, our favorite president, my favorite president, he's routinely ranked as the best president America's ever had. Even he defied the Chief Justice of the United States, Roger Taney, um, regarding habeas corpus, right? And when he suspended habeas corpus at the inception of the Civil War. Um, Roger Taney, the Chief Justice, said his actions were unconstitutional, but he ignored him anyway, right? But the he was a lawyer, and later on, Congress came and indemnified him. Now, often the situation is that the president, who is a party man and the leader of his party while he's president, his party will often back him. So his party in Senate in Congress will often back him. That was the case in um, under President Lincoln. Republicans dominated the Congress and the Senate, and so they supported him, they backed him. The same thing with FDR, right? Currently, President Trump is, uh, has the backing of the Republican Party that would indemnify him, so they dominate the House and the Senate, right? And that's why he's terrified, expressed his concern that if they did not win the midterms, then he'll be impeached, right? So, yes, Congress, technically on paper, has more power than the president in that they can remove him. Well, we consider them in legal terms. We try and consider them as co-equal branches of government, and not that they do different jobs, and their jobs, they're supposed to check each other, right? That was the idea, that we separated our government into three main branches, and not one is not more important than the other, right? The executive enforces the laws, and the uh, legislature makes the laws, and the judiciary interprets the laws. So we try to divide, separate their duties and functions, and of course, everyone is supposed to be equal. Nobody's going to say that the leg is more important than the arm, right? Or the left arm is more important than the right arm. You want the whole all the organs to be united, to be doing their things and working, uh, you know, doing their functions and be there whole, right? So that's the idea of the U.S. government. Um, so that was just what I wanted to talk about. That um, Congress, because Congress created, but technically, right? Technically, because Congress, in practice, or technically, let me put it that way, because Congress created the executive, and they still have the power to remove. Um, they have the power to remove the president. The president has no power to remove any senator, any senator, any congressman. The president cannot do it, right? But the Congress, the Senate, they have the power to remove the president. So clearly, they have more. Technically, they have more power. It's never been put in practice in our 250-year history, going on 250 years now. It's never been put in practice, right? Um, and when we remember in England, right? I've taken the time in previous videos to show the history of England, because our government also inherited the traditions from the English government, right? Many of our traditions are from the English government, because the English government created the 13 colonies, right? They chartered them, right? Um, in the beginning, up until the Magna Carta, it was a king who claimed he had divine rights, right? His power was from God, from the Bible, that it was from God. Um, it was a king who was the executive branch of government. He created parliament. He was forced to create parliament in 1215 with the signing of the Magna Carta, right? But he disbanded them, right? And he refused to call them into service up until King Charles I, and they went to civil war. And by that time, we had a bicameral parliament in England, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. The House of Lords were his former barons, right? They were the lords, the aristocrats. But the House of Commons won the Civil War, and before they could put the king on trial, which had never been done before, what they did was they abolished the that was parliament. They didn't really have the power to do that. And that's why you see later on, by the time of the restoration in 1660, after Oliver Cromwell had died of natural causes, they declared the acts of the Republic unconstitutional. They were all illegal acts. Because what Parliament did was they abolished the monarchy and they abolished the House of Lords. So it was just Parliament. And they were saying all power, you know, was in their hands, and it was given to them by the people, because now they were claiming to be the representatives of the people. And so they tried to put the king on trial, convicted him, and executed him. They decapitated him, right? Um, and so we see, and over time, of course, when there was a restoration, of course, the powers of parliament. But again, they were sort of series of coups that brought back the king, and there was a restoration. And but by the time of the Glorious Revolution, in which they deposed the the king again through some maneuvering, right, and brought uh, William of Orange to be king, jointly with, who was Dutch, jointly with Mary II, who was actually the daughter of the king they deposed. They gave them conditions. That was a Bill of Rights. So they had their Bill of Rights. So before America had its Bill of Rights, England had its Bill of Rights in 1688, 1689, and the king and queen had to uh, agree to it, the Bill of Rights, which effectively gave Parliament more power and made England a constitutional monarchy. So the king was now just a figurehead. So it gave the Parliament more power than um, give Parliament more power than the monarch, right? So in England today, even though the king, even though they swear an oath to the king, we also in the coronation of King Charles, they swear an oath to the king. In reality, he's just a figurehead, right? So Parliament can do away with the king if they choose to, if they decide to. But because England has such a rich history, and the king is sort of a symbol of continuity and of their tradition and history, the English people prefer to have the monarchy there. But the government, it's Parliament, which creates the executive. They're the ones who have the real power. They have the real power. And so in America, again, as I was saying, Congress has more power than the president. But we created a very dynamic president. We tried to make him seem like an emperor, but he's not quite like an emperor, right? Because the Senate could not remove the emperor, right? During the time of the Roman Empire under Augustus and his successors. But in America, the Congress still has the power to remove the president. And so we can see every president is elected into office, right? And well, I just wanted to discuss that to remind us that, well, Congress is more powerful than the president, because Congress created the executive of office. So you can see in order of the numbers, Congress is Article 1, um, and the executive is Article 2, and the judiciary is Article 3 of the Constitution. My name is Olu Osha. I like talking about American presidents, and I also draw attention to color of law violations, pivoting on subordination of perjury and fraud on the courts. Um, I was assaulted in my home on May 16, 2023. I was framed by Montgomery County Police in order to obstruct justice. As of that day, May 16, 2023, I was an auditor in the Department of the Navy, and I had reported fraud and misconduct in the Department of the Navy and Department of the Defense, which is my constitutional right. This was under investigation. I was swatted, and Jide Warere, a man possibly who acted maliciously and fabricated an emergency evaluation petition, and he was suborned to commit perjury. And everything he wrote was false. Uh, a judge, a corrupt, racist, and xenophobic judge, Judge James Bonifant of Montgomery County, Maryland, has committed fraud on the court as well, and he's suborned perjury, and he's continued to violate my constitutional rights. The state attorney's office under John McCarthy has committed prosecutorial misconduct by filing false charges. I'm an innocent man, law abiding American citizen, and they've done it in order to obstruct justice in the Department of Defense to prevent an investigation of government misconduct and public corruption perpetrated by a Jamie A. Simon, who's of Montgomery County, Maryland, and a Kirsten Risbeck, who's also affiliated with Montgomery County, and other rogue agents of the Department of Defense and Department of the Navy, including so it was a conspiracy to violate my civil rights, and an abusive process has been perpetrated by the courts in Montgomery County, Maryland, and the state attorney's office. And my rights have been violated. I've been discredited. In order to discredit me, and I've been defamed. The reason I've been doing these videos is because I've literally been held hostage in the state of Maryland. I haven't had a trial. There have been false charges filed against me. And every time the corrupt judge, James Bonifant, postpones and cancels trials, it's been going on 3 years now. This is the third year. And he made me lose my job. As he said it, even though I had an excellent job, a six-figure job at the Department of Defense at the Pentagon, he said he wanted me to lose my job. He's a racist judge who has no rights. He has no authority. What he did was unconstitutional. It violates my 14th Amendment rights. When the police came to my home, 40 of them, they did not give me notice, right, that there was an emergency evaluation petition. They did not give me my right to dispute. The courts didn't give me my right to dispute it, or my family the right to dispute it. Instead, they conjured up a lunatic, James Jide Iwari, and a fabulist and a perjurer, right? And this has been the pretext that they've used. The police officer, Demarcus Coleman, who's affiliated with the Navy and Marines, fabricated a charge statement. What he wrote down was a fabrication. The body cam shows that it's a fabrication. The police officer who actually shot me in the head and who confessed that he won under oath that his intention was to kill me with a Glock. Um, he he falsified a statement that I assaulted him. There's no evidence of this, and that never happened. I don't know if he's delusional, no, and that's why we're saying that the mental health of cops in America, law enforcement, it has to be made public. We know of the ICE agent who recently uh, killed, who killed without justification, killed an American citizen just recently. And I was fortunate because these officers, this was what they planned to come and do in my home. I was a law-abiding American citizen working in the federal government. I don't own any firearms. I've never owned firearms. But this madman Jide where he lied that I threatened to shoot him. And he's recanted this. He's the one who should have been arrested, who's the one who should have been prosecuted. My family is taking him to court in Nigeria because one, he lied, misrepresented himself as my uncle. He's not my uncle. He didn't invite me to America. He never paid for my school fees. I wasn't living in his house. But I'm a friendly person, and he abused that. And his claims now are that it was the Navy, the government that suborned him, that pressured him, coerced him to fabricate his statements that sent the police to my home. It was justified. You know, this is a violation of the rule of law, and it impugns the integrity of our judicial process, of our legal system, right? And it desecrates our values. In any event, I'll keep you posted. Thank you.